In this video, I'll be building my new workbench from the plans that are available on my website. And if you're interested in building one for yourself, there's a link in the description that'll take you right there. You can pick them up and get started immediately. There are a few reasons why I'm calling this the ultimate workbench. First and foremost is that it is, in my opinion, the perfect size for the average workshop. Second is how easy it is to build. Even though this looks complex, it's really not that bad. Third reason is the built-in vices that are included with the plan. And the fourth is that the top is dimensionally stable. You build it flat, it stays flat, you don't have to reflatten it ever. And finally, you have a lot of flexibility with what you finish the top with. I chose to use white oak on mine, but you can just as easily use something replaceable like hardboard or plywood or any other type of wood you want. You can even do this with epoxy if that's the kind of look you're going for. I started by cutting out all of the solid wood parts that I need to build the bench. And some of those need to be thicker than the stock that I have. So I'm gluing two pieces together to get that thickness, and I'll set those aside and let them dry until I'm ready to use them. I just finished marking locations on these parts, which are the brackets on the top and the feet on the bottom that fasten to the legs, which are these parts. And to do that, I'm using bolts. So I'm going to drill these out to the correct size, beginning with the counter bore, which is around 3/8 of an inch deep, and then drilling all the way through with the 3/8 inch bit. So this goes on top like that. That'll not only locate it in the correct place, it'll guide it straight in and wind up with holes that are in the right place. So I started with placing the legs roughly where they're going to go. Then I took a lot of the weight out of my toolbox and I got it moved off the stand that it was on and over here onto the first trestle, the wide one. And then I got the other trestle put on in the same way. After that, I leveled it up. And to do that, I used a tilt block. You normally use these on your table saw to adjust the blade. And then I cut custom size shims that just snugly fit underneath, and now I have a base that is absolutely level. I'll break in here for a second and tell you that this is my next full tutorial on the Maker's Mob. It's actually live right now as you're watching this video. And for a limited time, you can sign up and get access to everything on the site for 75% off. And like I said, this is a limited time offer, so act fast. With the base assembled and leveled, I can put together the top, starting with the dog hole strip. And the stock that I'm using is oak, but I added a strip of walnut to the top just to give it that walnut look on the surface. The first block in the strip is 1 inch wide, and I'm getting that glued up first. And I'll let that dry before I put on the rest. Now, since I don't want any metal, screws, or nails or anything on the top of this workbench, I'm actually nailing these blocks in place with 1/4 inch dowels. And then I can add dowels to the bottom, and that will lock them in place so that they won't move while I'm gluing it up. And then I can take it all apart again and get some glue on there and actually glue it up. I'm going to get a lot of clamps on here and then set it aside and let it dry completely before I do anything else with it. And while that's drying, I can start laying out and cutting the dovetails in the parts that need them. And I'm going to stop here and say that you really don't need these dovetails. If you want to put these joints together like a normal butt joint with screws and glue, that's fine. There's not a lot of stress on these joints, so it really doesn't need strong joinery. I'm more or less doing it because I think it looks neat. I'm using a guide block to make sure that I get 90-degree cuts here with my chisel. So I cut all of the dovetails first, and those are in the thinner oak parts. And now I'm going to cut the pins in the walnut parts, which are thicker. And I'm going to use the dovetails that I already cut to lay those out. And with the first one cut, I can put it together. And this is a good fit, especially for someone that doesn't do this all the time. So while I was wasting a lot of time hand cutting that stuff, the glue dried on the dog hole strip, so I can get the outside edge glued on. And once again, I'm using dowels to locate it. And anyone living in the southern climate really won't appreciate this, but I had to break out the heat gun to warm up the wood a little bit for the regular woodworking glue that I'm using to glue this together. And then once again, I can get it assembled and get a lot of clamps on there. The next thing I need to work on is the wagon vise, and that goes through the end cap, so I need to drill a 1-inch hole and also route out a recess for the washer. This is optional. I chose to do it because I think it looks more refined, but you don't have to do this. It works exactly the same if you don't. The lead screw for the wagon vise is 1-inch threaded rod, cut to 9 inches long, and it needs a nut fastened near the middle. And to lock that in place, I'm drilling a 3/16 inch hole through and then pinning it together with a bolt that's a snug fit in there. What I'm doing here is I'm drilling a 1-inch hole into the end for the lead screw, and then a nut needs to be glued into the end of the jaw where I drill that hole. And then to remove the rest, you can do that by hand, of course, with a chisel, or you can do it the more efficient way with a router and a straight cutting bit. Just very carefully route around until the nut fits in there nicely. Next, I made the plate that I need for the shoulder vise. And to drill the 1-inch hole in the middle, you can use a hole saw if you have the right size and go slow and use oil. Or you can do it like I did here, drill a series of holes all the way around, and then carefully tilt the drill bit to ream out the material in between the holes until you get as much of that out of there as you can, and knock out that plug in the middle, and I use a round file to clean up the rest. I also drilled holes, one in each corner, for the screws that'll hold the plate in place, and countersunk those for the head of the flathead screws. And then I cut the lead screw for the shoulder vise to the right length, and I threaded on one nut, put the plate on, threaded on another nut, and those nuts need to be keyed to the threaded rod so they don't turn. I drilled the hole to the right size for the number 10 screw, tapped it out, and drove in the screw. And that's probably the best way, although you need a tap to do that. And then going further with the shoulder vise, I drilled the hole for the lead screw through the shoulder. And then exactly like the wagon vise, I use the nut itself to mark out where I need to route out the recess, and I pre-drilled that and then routed out the rest. I'm at the point where I can do the next major glue up, and it's this joint right here where the wagon vise is. I need to get that put through the hole like so. And the glue I'm using is polyurethane construction adhesive, mainly because it's cold in my shop and regular woodworking glue doesn't work that well when it's cold. And here's how the wagon vise should move. It needs to slide back and forth freely without getting hung up. And then to get ready to work on this corner over here, I started by making the clamp pad. And this one is fairly simple. It's just a block of wood. The only tricky part is that it has a tongue on the edge. And it also needs a pretty big counterbore for the nut that's on the end of the lead screw. And with the clamp pad done, I could line up the steel plate that I made for the shoulder vise on the clamp pad, mark the holes, and drill those out to drive in the 1-inch wood screws that hold that in place. I had one other thing I had to do with the shoulder, and that was to drill the holes for the threaded rods, starting with counterbores. I also made the shoulder supports that wrap around the threaded rod. Then I could get the lead screw threaded into the nut on the shoulder, get that put in place, and tighten up the nuts on the threaded rods. And then with all that done, I could glue on the end cap. And once again, I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive. Next, I need to make the spindles for the two vices. And these are the walnut blocks that I glued up at the beginning. Then I can mark the center on the end and drill that out with a 1-inch bit for the 1-inch lead screw. After that, I marked and drilled the hole for the cross pin that keys the spindles to the lead screws. And then the final hole that I have to drill here is the 7/8 inch one for the handle. Normally you would make the spindles on the lathe and make them round. However, a lot of guys don't have a lathe, so I came up with a way of doing it on a table saw. Just by knocking off the corners, you get something that's close enough to being round, and plus I think it looks kind of neater. And I'm using an old CD that I notched to fit around the rod as a spacer. It has to be notched though because you have to pull this out again after the glue dries. And with the spindle clamped tightly in place, I can drill that hole for the cross pin. And for the cross pin itself, I actually used the shaft of a very long drill bit that I had. But I'm pretty sure you can get 3/16 inch steel rod at any home center, and you can use that instead. After that, I made the handles from oak. I made my own dowels here, although you can buy that as well, already made. And for the end caps, I used pieces of Baltic birch plywood, just cut it to a rough circle on the bandsaw, tuned it up on my belt sander, and I rounded over the corners with a piece of sandpaper. And while I was doing the wagon vise, I did the shoulder vise as well. Then I could cut the parts for the core of the top, starting with the 1/2 inch plywood. And here I'm gluing on what I'm calling the core cleats. And then after the glue dries on that, I can get it put in place and fastened to the workbench with a bunch of 1/4 inch dowels. And while I'm doing this, I'm making sure that the plywood is flush with the bottom. I gave the glue on the dowels about a 1/2 hour to dry, and then I cleaned out the tray inside here, made sure that everything's out of here. I don't want anything holding up the MDF layer. And to clamp these layers in place, I'm going to be using screws that I'll be taking out after the glue sets. And I'm not going to be using a lot of glue, and these layers don't need it. To install the top layer of plywood, I ran a bead of polyurethane construction adhesive all the way around the perimeter where the core cleat meets the edge of the workbench. And this will lock everything together right at that location. And then to glue down the plywood, I actually used the polyurethane construction adhesive again, except I used more this time. I put lots of thin beads along the length, and that's to absolutely fasten that plywood down to the MDF underneath. Then I use my trim router with a pair of aluminum rails that are very stiff and level the top of that plywood by taking off a very small amount. The top of this bench will be covered with strips that I'm going to plane down to the exact thickness that they need to be to fit in here. And I want it to be absolutely perfect when I do. I don't want any messing around with the top to try to level it after I glue those strips in. One of the neat things about this workbench is that you can put any wood that you want on the top. And if you want to, you can even put on something that's easily replaceable, like hardboard or plywood. But I'm going to be using white oak that is as close to quarter sawn as I can get it. And to do that, I'm cutting this board into thin, narrow strips. And then after I had them all planed to the right thickness, I had to trim off the edge as well. And I did this in several passes on my table saw using my fancy new feather board to hold them up tight against the fence. And to make these strips fit perfectly, I'm very carefully marking them out, cutting them a little bit long, and then sneaking up on the fit until they're perfect by trimming a very small amount off on the miter saw. One of the great things about this glue is how much time you have to work with it, especially if it's cold in your shop. And now I can start laying the strips in. I'm just going to make sure that they're nice and clean. Now you'll notice that I'm not putting glue between the strips. And if you do wind up with any gaps after this goes together, which you shouldn't if you're careful, you can always use regular wood filler to fill up those gaps. And then I've got all these cauls that will reach across from one side of the workbench to the other and work with the clamps that I have to clamp it down. I left that to dry overnight, then I did the other half the next day. And then after that was dry, I checked the top and it was awesome, perfectly flat. And then the last thing to do is some sanding and of course finishing. And I'm using water-based polyurethane. I'm going to put 2 coats on everything, including the bottom, lightly sanding in between coats. Now, like I said at the beginning, there are plans for this workbench. If you're interested in building one for yourself, follow the link in the description and pick them up. And I should also mention that this bench was designed to fit around my large toolbox. What this gives you is all of the tools that you use at your workbench right at your fingertips in a very convenient location that's protected from the dust that you're creating in your shop. Also remember that this is your chance to join the Makers Mob at a greatly reduced price, 75% off for your first month, and you'll get access to all of my projects, but also all of the projects that are on the site from YouTube's top makers, such as the Samurai Carpenter, Jimmy DiResta, John Peters, Frank Howarth, and Neil Paskin. If you're serious about learning woodworking and adding to your knowledge base, this is the place to be. And like I said, this is a limited time offer, so act fast.